This empire may look like the cradle of law, order and culture, but it is not what you think. Because beneath its polished marble and golden statues was a system built to break the human mind before it ever touched the flesh. Rome did not only conquer land, it conquered identity, memory, and dignity. Its rulers learned that the most powerful form of punishment was not the sword, but fear, isolation, humiliation, and the feeling that a person had already lost before the pain even began. What looked like civil justice was often psychological destruction, carefully arranged to remind every citizen that life, honor, and even self-worth existed only under the emperor's permission. If torture became more than pain, if it became identity and spectacle, then Rome itself is proof that once cruelty is turned into policy, society no longer fears crime, it fears the ruler. When the emperor becomes the law, suffering becomes a stage, and death is no longer punishment but performance. In such a world, mercy is weakness, fear becomes loyalty, and the human soul is bent long before the body is broken. When cruelty is institutionalized, people stop living as citizens and start surviving as subjects, trapped in a theater where no one knows whether they are the audience or the next victim. Nero did not simply use torture to punish, he used it to perform. To the citizens of Rome, he was not just an emperor, but a spectacle dressed in gold, music, and ego. Yet behind the theater stood a man who turned suffering into ceremony and death into decor. When the Great Fire devastated the city in 64 CE, Nero found not tragedy, but opportunity. He did not restore hope, he staged blame. He chose Christians as his scapegoats, not because they were guilty, but because they were vulnerable, isolated, and easy to break in the eyes of the crowd. Ancient historians like Tacitus record how these victims were not simply executed, but displayed. They were nailed to crosses, torn by dogs, or covered in pitch and burned alive as night lamps for Nero's private gardens. Their deaths were arranged like stage pieces, placed among nobles and guests, lit like living torches to glow through the emperor's celebrations. Pain was not hidden. It was choreographed. Nero's cruelty always carried a second target, the witnesses. By forcing the elite to dine beside human flames, he taught them that Rome no longer punished rebellion. Rome exhibited obedience. Senators and nobles watched not just the death of the condemned, but the death of boundaries. If a slave could become a torch, a senator could become a corpse before dessert. No one was safe once pain had become part of public entertainment. Even his own family was not spared. His mother, Agrippina, who had once secured his path to the throne, was eliminated after staged accidents failed. He did not simply remove threats, he demonstrated control over life itself. Under Nero, Rome learned a new rule. Cruelty is not strongest when it is loud, but when it is beautiful, extravagant, and treated like art. In his hands, torture became a message carved into Rome's culture, a warning that the emperor no longer needed loyalty, only fear dressed as applause. When Nero turned cruelty into spectacle, Caligula turned it into humiliation. He did not only want people to die, he wanted them to collapse first from dignity. His rule was not about law, justice, or punishment, but about proving that every life in Rome existed for his amusement. Under Caligula, pain was not the final blow, it was the punchline. He enjoyed forcing the powerful to behave like prisoners and the proud to kneel like performers in his private comedy. Senators were summoned not for counsel, but for mockery. Trials became rehearsed jokes where the verdict was known before the accusation. A man could be executed not because he was disloyal, but because the emperor found the moment entertaining. Once, according to Cassius Dio, he ordered a man's death during dinner, then continued eating as the body was dragged past the guests, as if cruelty was simply part of the menu. Caligula's laughter was not joy, it was a warning, the sound that told Rome someone else would soon suffer. When the games slowed or the crowd grew restless, he reportedly ordered spectators thrown into the arena to be torn apart, simply to keep things interesting. In his presence, survival required not obedience, but unpredictability. No one could guess what might amuse him next. Women were not spared either. The wives and daughters of Rome's elite were seized, degraded, and then returned to their families as a demonstration of helplessness. Under his rule, no honor was secure, and no protection existed except his mood. The terror of Caligula was not just death, it was absurdity. People could no longer trust law, logic, or the boundaries of power. When suffering becomes entertainment, innocence becomes irrelevant. And every living person is already standing on the edge of a stage they never chose. If Nero ruled through fire and Caligula through laughter, Domitian ruled through silence. His cruelty did not roar in arenas or burn in gardens. It lived behind doors that never opened again. He turned fear into a constant presence, not by spectacle but by invisibility. Under his rule, people did not fear pain. They feared being noticed. Domitian weaponized suspicion. Instead of public trials, he preferred secret questioning. Instead of open executions, he used quiet disappearances. Under earlier emperors, death was seen. Under Domitian, it was felt. A friend who spoke too freely might vanish the next morning. A senator who hesitated before answering might never return from the palace chambers. There was no audience, only silence, and the knowledge that somewhere a scream was being swallowed by stone walls. He revived treason laws, not to defend Rome, but to erase opposition. A word, a gesture, even hesitation could be defined as disloyalty. Guilt was no longer connected to action, only to accusation. Informers thrived. Trust died. The empire became a stage of whispers, where every conversation might be the last one spoken in safety. Domitian did not need applause like Nero or laughter like Caligula. He needed control over breath itself. The breath a person took before speaking, before thinking, before daring to feel safe. Torture under his rule was a tool of erasure. No spectacle, no display, only absence. What Rome feared most was not pain, but being taken without a witness. By the time he was assassinated, even his own household no longer feared his enemies more than they feared him. But the damage survived him. Domitian proved that cruelty does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it enters quietly, seals the door, and leaves the world guessing whether you ever existed at all, where Domitian hid cruelty in walls. Commodus dragged it back into the open, not as justice, but as entertainment built around himself. He did not want to be feared like a ruler. He wanted to be worshipped like a spectacle. Under his reign, the arena was no longer a place of sport. It was the emperor's personal stage, and every act of violence existed to feed his ego. Commodus entered the Colosseum dressed as a gladiator, not to risk his life but to pretend he conquered it. The fights were staged. His opponents disarmed or weakened before they ever stepped onto the sand. Animals were slaughtered by the dozens, not for defense, but for applause. He performed death as theater, but the true targets were not the victims, it was the audience. They were forced to cheer, to admire, to pretend. Survival became a ritual of flattery. Under him, the boundary between emperor and entertainer collapsed. Power no longer protected the state, it entertained it. Months were renamed after his titles. Statues were crafted in his image as Hercules, and resistance was not treason against Rome, but disrespect against his persona. When cruelty is tied to ego, it becomes more than punishment. It becomes identity. Not I rule because I hold power, but I rule because your life proves it. Even laughter in the stands could become a death sentence if he believed it was not admiration, but mockery. Under Commodus, the arena was not a venue, it was a mirror. Everyone who entered it, whether fighter or spectator, was trapped in his fantasy. Rome was no longer a republic, nor even an empire. It was a theater with a throne at center stage, and like every performance built on fear, it ended the moment the audience stopped clapping. His own inner circle arranged his assassination, proving that once cruelty becomes entertainment, even the closest hands learn to drop the curtain. The reigns of Nero, Caligula, Domitian, and Commodus were not accidents of history. They were the logical outcome of power without limits, proof that when fear becomes administration, cruelty becomes culture. These emperors did not simply punish the body. They dismantled the mind, the dignity, and the meaning of being human inside an imperial system that expected obedience not through law, but through fear dressed as ritual. Nero used flames to teach Rome that death could be beautiful if it pleased the ruler. Caligula used humiliation to show that a life could be destroyed for laughter. Domitian used silence to make people fear their own voices. Commodus used spectacle to turn life itself into his personal trophy. Each of them revealed a different face of the same truth. Unchecked power always evolves into cruelty. First as punishment, then as entertainment, and finally as identity. Rome did not just torture bodies. It engineered submission. It perfected psychological control long before the first blow was struck. When pain becomes policy, the soul breaks before the flesh ever does. That is what these emperors leave behind, not merely stories of brutality, but a warning carved into history. A civilization collapses not when it is invaded from the outside, but when its rulers learn to enjoy the suffering of their own people. Rome teaches us that tyranny does not begin with blood. It begins with the moment cruelty stops being hidden and starts being normalized. If you found this glimpse into Rome's darker truths important, then support the channel, like the video, share it forward, and subscribe for more history that shows what power truly becomes when no one can stop it. Your comment matters, not just as feedback, but as a voice standing against silence. Tell me below, which emperor's cruelty shocked you the most and why? And if you want more forgotten history told without filters, hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapter.